Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on an issue that is, well, it's just dominating headlines right now, particularly around some proposed legislation in Florida. But the implications here are massive. They're sweeping, and frankly, they're often ignored by any large institution that has to operate in a high-stakes, high-density environment.
We are talking about campus carry.
We are. Specifically, this whole contentious issue of authorizing employees, faculty, staff, maybe even administration, to carry concealed firearms on college grounds.
And it is a lightning rod topic. You can't get away from the intense political and, well, the emotional noise around it. And that's understandable. People on both sides of the ideological fence feel very, very strongly about the safety and the rights involved.
Absolutely. The headlines are loud, and they seem to focus almost entirely on that ideological fight. You're either for or against the right to carry on campus.
Right.
But, that is the conversation everyone else is having. For this deep dive, we are setting that entire debate aside.
I have to.
Our source material today, which is an incredibly insightful analysis from Valortec training, argues that everyone, legislatures, the institutions themselves, the media, they're all missing the single most crucial point.
Correct. So the mission for us today is to cut through all that ideology and really analyze the true, unaddressed liability issue. The issue that begins the absolute moment that policy is signed into law. We're shifting the whole discussion from a debate about rights to, well, a cold, hard analysis of professional standards and risk management.
And the premise is stark. I mean, it's almost confrontational. The analysis argues that allowing an employee to carry a firearm on a college campus without first mandating this high-level, professional, really specialized training.
It's not protection.
No. They say it's institutional negligence waiting to happen.
And that's because it fundamentally changes the legal exposure of the college or university. Our focus has to be on the operational reality and the standard of training you need for such a complex, high-risk place.
Because those are the standards the courts will look at?
Exactly. Courts scrutinize standards, not political intent.
So our mission today is to unpack why this isn't just an ideological argument or even a generalized safety one. It's a fundamental issue of, well, risk management, liability law, and the operational standards the judicial system will inevitably use to judge an institution's competence.
And to do that, we'll start by looking at the profound legal shift that happens the second an institution says, okay, where people can be armed. Then we'll dive into the extreme, unique complexity of the campus environment itself.
Right.
And finally, we will define the exacting professional standards of training that are necessary to mitigate what the source correctly calls a massive institutional exposure.
That sounds like a journey from a political policy right into a courtroom.
Okay, let's unpack that legal shift. Because for the institution, for the college, this is really the starting point. This is where their liability begins to swell. Okay, so we have to establish a critical distinction right out of the gate here. For the average person, carrying a firearm is all seen through the lens of personal self-defense. The CCW scenario, concealed carry weapon permit.
Exactly. It's an individual's right. And the training standard for that is, well, let's be honest, it's generally pretty low. It's focused on basic law compliance, basic safety.
And that's fine. For simple self-defense outside of a professional context, that's the established standard. But the moment a college or university authorizes its employees to carry, and it doesn't matter if they're professors, library staff, or deans, the legal landscape just shifts dramatically.
It's a completely different game.
It is. It stops being purely about personal self-defense under state CCW law, and it transforms. It becomes a function of employment, of institutional policy, and of professional standards. The armed employee is now acting, or could potentially act, as a de facto agent of the university during a crisis.
And that means a whole suite of legal concepts just immediately snaps into place. Concepts that, might have been totally irrelevant before this policy change. So what are the core legal ideas that institutions immediately inherit, regardless of what the state law says about just allowing carry?
The source material identifies several really critical ones. These are the standards that a court, not the legislature, is going to apply when a civil suit lands on their docket after something terrible happens. These concepts are what define negligence.
Okay, so let's start at the foundation. The idea that really underpins all of this institutional liability. Duty of care.
Right. Duty of care is the inherent responsibility an institution have to protect everyone on its property. Students, staff, visitors, everyone.
That makes sense.
So when they introduce a new high-stakes element of risk, which is armed personnel who are not professional police officers, they automatically take on a higher standard for making sure that risk is managed safely.
So they're raising the stakes on themselves.
They are. Think of it like this. If they choose to arm non-professional employees, they now have a legal duty to make sure those employees are professionally competent in using that weapon
Wow.
in that specific high-risk environment. And if they don't provide that training, they've potentially violated their duty of care.
And that duty of care is directly linked to another idea you mentioned, foreseeability. This sounds like the legal system basically asking, could you have seen this coming?
That's exactly what it is. Foreseeability is about the predictable risk that comes with placing armed, non-professional people in a high-stress, complex, dense environment like a college campus.
And a campus is definitely all of those things.
Absolutely. If you authorize hundreds of people who might only have that minimal CCW training to carry a deadly weapon in a crowded stadium during a football game or in a lecture hall during finals, it is profoundly foreseeable that a misidentification could happen.
Or a negligent discharge.
Or a negligent discharge, or an inappropriate escalation of force during a high chaos event. And once a risk is deemed foreseeable, and this one clearly is, the institution has a legal duty to actively mitigate it.
Through professional training.
Through professional training. And the failure to mitigate a foreseeable risk, that is the textbook definition of negligence.
It's interesting because the foreseeable risks here aren't just about an external threat, an attacker. They're about the risk introduced by the policy itself.
Precisely.
Which brings us to a term that I imagine must sound like fingernails on a chalkboard to risk managers. Negligent entrustment. This seems particularly damning when you're talking about a firearm.
It is the heart of the liability issue that the source highlights. Negligent entrustment means providing a tool, and again, a firearm is the highest stakes tool possible, to an employee who is not adequately equipped or trained to use it responsibly within the scope of their employment. So if an employee is only trained to that minimal civilian CCW standard, yet the institution has authorized them to act as a kind of rapid response asset in a campus crisis.
They're entrusting them with a job they weren't trained for.
Exactly. The institution is entrusting deadly power to someone they have not professionally verified as competent for that high-risk task. This is where the legal system asks a very simple question. Did the institution know, or should it have known, that this person was inadequately trained for the specific job they were being authorized to perform?
And if the answer is yes,
that's negligent entrustment.
So the argument here is that simply having a state permit is nowhere near enough to counter that claim of negligent entrustment.
Not at all.
Because the specific context of a campus crisis demands a much higher professional skill set.
Precisely. The institution can't hide behind the state law that just grants permission. They're the ones who put the policy in place. Therefore, they're the ones responsible for the professional competence of their staff.
So if that employee makes a catastrophic mistake, say shooting a person who is just fleeing in panic rather than being an actual threat, the liability doesn't just stop with the individual shooter.
No, not even close. And that's where institutional liability and vicarious liability come into play, and that's where the college itself becomes the primary target of the lawsuit.
The ultimate deep pocket.
Yeah.
Let's break down what that financial consequence really looks like.
Okay, so institutional liability is the institution's direct responsibility for the policies, the standards, and, the inadequate training they set. Vicarious liability means the institution is also liable for the actions or inactions of its employees as long as they were committed within the scope of their work.
So, an example. A faculty member who is armed under this institutional policy makes a grievous error. Maybe they mistake a responding police officer for a threat and fire. Someone is injured or killed.
In that case, the institution holds the primary liability.
Why?
Because the college was the authorizing body. The employee was acting under the delegated authority of that campus carry policy. So a finding of gross negligence in a civil suit, it could potentially bankrupt a large college endowment. This isn't just theoretical legal talk. It is an enormous financial risk.
And the final piece of this legal puzzle, the one that really defines the outcome of any lawsuit, is this overarching concept: failure to train.
This becomes the central and usually the most devastating claim in any civil litigation that follows. The courts, as the source points out, are purely transactional. They don't care about politics. They don't care about the philosophical intent of the bill.
They care about standards.
They care only about standards and due diligence. They look for evidence that the institution actively protected its community from the foreseeable risks that it created with its policy.
So when the worst thing imaginable happens, a tragic misidentification, a negligent discharge in a crowded stairwell, an escalation of force, the legal focus shifts entirely. It moves away from the legislative permission.
And right on to the operational standard.
Exactly. The court's focus immediately bypasses the simple question, were they legally allowed to carry?
Which is easily answered yes by the state bill.
Right. And it moves to the much more complex and frankly damning question. What training did the institution require, and did that training actually prepare this individual to manage the specific complexities of putting a gun into a learning environment?
The moment the college creates the policy, they create the liability. And the only way to defend that position is to demonstrate professional-grade training that meets the unique and extreme demands of the campus reality.
So the core takeaway here is that permission to carry does not equal professional competence.
Not at all.
And in the eyes of the court, competence is the only thing that matters when they're deciding on institutional negligence. But to understand what that competence even looks like, we have to really grasp just how complex this environment is.
Okay, so the legal framework is established. Now we have to look at the environment itself. I think a lot of people, when they hear campus carry, they automatically picture, a quiet, isolated, defensive event.
Right, stopping a lone attacker in an office after hours or something. Exactly. But the source completely challenges that assumption. It describes college campuses as some of the most complex, difficult, and dynamic armed environments imaginable.
And this is where we really have to dismantle the assumptions that are built into basic civilian carry courses. A CCW holder is typically trained for, simple, low-density, open environments.
Like a defensive action in a home or a street mugging?
A gas station robbery, exactly. A college campus during an active crisis is the polar opposite of that scenario. The sheer density and the architecture of a campus just amplify every single risk factor.
So can you walk us through the specific factors that elevate that risk, the things that turn a college campus into this extreme liability environment?
We need to detail these because they're what fundamentally define the training curriculum that's required. First, you have dense populations in confined spaces.
Right.
Imagine a crisis erupting during a lecture changeover. You have hundreds, maybe thousands of people moving simultaneously through narrow hallways. Incidents happen in lecture halls, crowded dining commons, shared office spaces.
All places with a lot of people in a very small area.
Exactly. And firing a weapon in such close quarters with that population density, it drastically increases the risk of collateral harm. You have overpenetration through walls or just simply missing the intended target and hitting someone behind them. The acoustic challenges alone, in a large echoing building, that can overwhelm your ability to communicate or even assess a threat accurately.
And then the demographic makeup adds another layer of complication. You have mixed ages and this unavoidable element of high emotional stress.
Yes. You have everyone from, 18-year-old freshmen to retired folks taking continuing education courses, plus staff, faculty, and this is important, minors. You have minors present at campus events, summer camps, maybe an adjacent daycare center.
That mixed age group just increases the moral and legal complexity of any use of force scenario.
Hugely. And crucially, any crisis is going to happen under absolute panic and chaos, where adrenaline is peaking for everyone. This physiological stress instantly degrades fine motor control, memory recall, and cognitive function for everybody involved.
Especially the armed employee.
Especially them.
And the sheer number of non-combatants, of innocent people, creates this massive problem of constant bystanders.
This is a huge game-changing factor. In a typical self-defense scenario, collateral damage might be a low probability. In a campus crisis, every single shot fired is likely to have dozens of bystanders nearby.
So misidentification, an errant round, a ricochet,
becomes a massive institutional liability risk. The decision to shoot has to be instantaneous and impeccably correct, knowing that a failure to discriminate between a threat and a bystander carries catastrophic, permanent consequences. The armed individual isn't just fighting the shooter, they are fighting the dynamics of the crowd itself.
Then you add the external variables that just compound the chaos. These are the factors that really define a professional response, not a civilian one. multiple responding agencies, and the simple fact that you'll have plainclothes carriers everywhere.
And these two factors together create the single biggest operational vulnerability in a campus crisis, the risk of a blue-on-blue incident, friendly fire.
Yeah.
You have to understand that law enforcement from the local police, county sheriff, maybe even state agencies, they are all going to descend on that campus, and quickly. They are trained to respond to armed threats.
So if faculty or staff are carrying in plain clothes, maybe they're wearing a backpack, running, and holding a weapon, they look identical to a shooter.
Identical, especially to a panicked, adrenaline-fueled responding officer who is navigating the low-light or confusing architecture of a school building.
The police response teams are taught to neutralize the threat, and in that fog of war, any unknown armed person is a potential threat.
Precisely. If that armed employee hasn't been trained in detailed practice protocols for what to do the moment uniformed law enforcement arrives on scene, they are exponentially increasing their own risk of being tragically misidentified and engaged by police.
Wow.
This is why the source emphasizes that a campus is a unique tactical environment. It is not a range lane. It is not a simple, isolated confrontation in a parking lot.
Okay, so given this extreme reality, the skills you need go way beyond just basic marksmanship. We need to look at the specialized skills that this complex reality demands, skills that a minimal CCW training course just doesn't even touch.
Absolutely. The institution must require training in what we call cognitive performance under duress.
Let's start with those cognitive skills. You mentioned threat discrimination under stress and judgmental shooting decision-making.
Right. The ability to quickly and accurately figure out who is a threat, who is simply a student fleeing in terror, and who might be an undercover officer or another armed employee, that is paramount.
And you can't learn that from a lecture.
No way! It requires high stress, force-on-force simulation to instill. If an armed employee sees someone running with what looks like a weapon, they have to assess instantly. Is that a phone? Is it a knife, a gun? Or maybe it's just a medical device.
And judgmental shooting.
That's the speed and accuracy of the shoot-no-shoot choice. Understanding that hesitation can cost lives, but an incorrect decision can create massive liability and turn an innocent person into a victim of the response, not the attack.
The physical skills required are also vastly different from what basic CCW covers, specifically weapon retention in close contact and movement through crowds.
In crowded, chaotic situations like a mob of students pushing through a doorway, physical contact is inevitable. An armed employee must be constantly and vigorously trained in maintaining physical control of their weapon.
To prevent it from being taken.
Exactly. To prevent it from being taken and used against them or others. This is a non-negotiable component of professional training. It often requires grappling and ground-fighting techniques that are nowhere near a standard CCW curriculum.
And moving through a crowd.
Moving through a panicked, dense crowd requires specific tactics to navigate without escalating the panic, without falling, or worst of all, losing control of the firearm. Any armed employee who is easily disarmed becomes a massive new source of threat on the scene.
And finally, the de-escalation component. De-escalation under adrenaline.
This is absolutely critical. The ability to verbally control a situation when your own physiological stress is peaking is the hallmark of professional training. A civilian CCW holder's primary directive is, often just self-preservation.
But an armed employee on campus.
They have that duty of care to the institution and the community. They must attempt to de-escalate if it's at all possible, using professional verbal techniques, even while their heart rate is 180 beats per minute and their vision is tunneling. This requires training that overcomes the natural fight-or-flight response.
The conclusion the source provides is sharp. It's almost chilling. They say anything less than these sophisticated specialized skills is simply reckless in this kind of environment, and therefore, it's a failure of the institution.
Okay, so this analysis of the campus reality leads us perfectly to the institutional decision-making process, because colleges, like any big organization, are often motivated by efficiency and, financial constraints.
Budgets are always tight. So if the state law allows campus carry, there is this perverse incentive for the institution to just meet the absolute bare minimum legal requirement. They think a simple state certification checkmark is sufficient to cover their legal basis.
It's safety theater on a budget.
Exactly.
And this is precisely where the liability trap is set, and it can be fatal for the institution. The state can grant the permission, but the institution still gets sued when the negligence occurs. If the institution just checks the box, they are actively creating a legal vulnerability that plaintiff attorneys will exploit mercilessly and, very likely, successfully.
How so?
They've demonstrated awareness of the risk by having a policy without demonstrating competent mitigation of that risk.
Okay, so let's detail the specific forms of minimal training that the source warns become this massive legal liability. What are the common inadequate efforts that often represent the extent of an institution's compliance?
There are 4 really common traps that institutions fall into, and when you put them all together, they form that paper trail of failure.
Okay, trap number 1. They rely on basic permit instruction.
Right. This is the entry-level standard for the general public. It's focused primarily on generalized law, basic safety, and maybe shooting a few rounds at a paper target. It is designed for simple, isolated self-defense.
Not for managing a complex, crowded crisis.
Not at all. It doesn't teach tactical awareness, coordination with other responders. It completely fails to address the unique pressures of the campus.
Okay, trap number 2. The use of online modules.
Ah, yes. The checkbox solution. While they're convenient, these modules lack any practical physical stress inoculation whatsoever. You cannot learn to discriminate a threat in a chaotic, acoustically challenging environment by clicking through a set of PowerPoint slides.
A plaintiff's attorney would have a field day with that.
They'll argue it demonstrates a clear, intentional lack of investment in the physical and cognitive training that is crucial for sound judgment with a deadly weapon.
Third trap. They only require a minimal range qualification.
This typically means shooting static, two-dimensional targets in a quiet, non-stress environment. The target isn't moving, you aren't moving, there's no noise, there are absolutely no innocent bystanders running around.
So it proves you can hit a piece of paper.
It proves minimal marksmanship competence, but it proves absolutely nothing about decision-making under stress, about movement, or about threat discrimination. In fact, it often instills a false sense of security that the person is actually prepared when they are not.
And the fourth and final trap,
Huh.
generic active shooter briefings.
These are theoretical only. They might outline the institutional policy, run, hide, fight, but they provide no physical practice in the use of force, no scenario-based interaction.
And certainly no training on the legal and tactical complexities of being the authorized armed response.
Exactly. They are briefings designed for compliance documentation, not for actual competency.
So when these 4 insufficient efforts are examined after an incident where force was used improperly, let's say a student was accidentally shot while running to safety, they collectively create what the source calls the paper trail of failure.
That's the phrase.
A paper trail of failure. That phrase should keep any college general counsel up at night. How exactly does a plaintiff's attorney use that paper trail against them in court?
Well, they use the discovery process to request every single piece of evidence related to training. They'll ask, did the training specifically address the risk of blue-on-blue incidents? Did the training simulate a classroom environment with innocent role players?
And when the institution's file only contains a CCW certificate, an online quiz score, and a record of shooting 10 rounds at a bullseye target.
The lawyer stands up, points to the policy that authorized the employee to carry in a dense crowd, and then contrasts it with the ridiculously minimal training that was provided. It demonstrates that the institution recognized the risk by implementing a policy, but demonstrably failed to provide training commensurate with that risk. They chose budgetary savings over professional competence.
And we know what phrase plaintiff attorneys love more than any other, because it leads directly to those high-dollar awards.
That phrase is failure to train to an appropriate standard. This is the linchpin. It's the core of almost all institutional negligence lawsuits that involve a high-stakes professional failure. The argument isn't that the person was untrained, it's that they were trained negligently for the high-risk job they were authorized to do.
And we have to clarify what that appropriate standard is, because this distinction is where the institution's entire defense just collapses.
Right. On a campus, the appropriate standard for an authorized armed employee is not civilian CCW competence. It is professional-grade defensive firearms training, something analogous to what modern low-liability law enforcement agencies require for their officers.
So a court won't ask if the employee met the state's minimal CCW requirement.
No. They will ask if the employee met the training standard necessary to safely operate a firearm in a densely populated, high-stress, complex educational setting. If the institution's required training doesn't match the operational reality we just talked about,
Then they've failed.
they have failed to meet the appropriate standard, they've confirmed the claim of negligent entrustment, and they are liable. The minimal training trap is the institution trying to save money in the short term, but unwittingly signing a massive check to future litigation in the long term.
Okay, so having defined the problem, this massive liability gap created by minimal training in a very complex environment, we have to pivot now to defining the only viable solution. And the analysis is unequivocal here. High-level training is not optional. It is the only legally defensible institutional position.
It's the cost of doing business. It is the cost of mitigating the risk that they chose to accept.
Right.
If a college is going to assume the risk of authorizing armed employees, they must also assume the extreme financial and logistical burden of training those employees to a standard that courts will recognize as professional and diligent.
And that training has to specifically address the unique challenges we've been talking about: the stress, the bystanders, the integrated response.
All of it.
The source outlines 5 essential components, 5 pillars, of high-level training that institutions have to mandate if they want to create a legally defensible position. Let's walk through each one, and let's really focus on the extensive detail required to meet that professional standard. Okay, starting with the law itself. Pillar 1. Basic CCW courses, they focus on self-defense. This pillar requires moving way beyond those general laws to the specific, complex applications and consequences of using deadly force within an institutional setting.
Where the armed person is an agent of the university.
Exactly.
The training here has to provide deep legal nuance. It needs to cover not just if you can shoot, but when and where you can shoot within the specific operational constraints of a campus and what the legal consequences are for everybody involved.
So what are the specifics here? What absolutely must be covered to call it advanced?
Well, first, they need to cover the explicit Florida statutes as they apply to the defense of others in an educational environment. This means really understanding the concept of intervening to protect a third party, which often carries a much higher level of scrutiny than pure personal self-defense.
They also have to study relevant case law.
Absolutely. Case law that defines the precedents for excessive force in high-density areas. This includes how judges have interpreted the idea of an imminent threat when innocent bystanders are present. It's not as simple as it sounds.
And the distinction between civil and criminal exposure is critical for the employee personally.
It is. The training must clearly delineate the difference between civil versus criminal exposure. Civil exposure is that inevitable negligence lawsuit against the institution and the individual. Criminal exposure is the individual prosecution for homicide or manslaughter.
So they need to understand that even a legally justified shooting
Can still lead to a lengthy and incredibly costly civil trial. The only real defense against that civil suit is overwhelming evidence of adequate training and policy adherence.
The training also have to enforce strict decision-making thresholds.
Yes, this is crucial. When does a perceived threat actually rise to the level requiring lethal force, especially when your perception is distorted by adrenaline? The training must force the employee to adhere to strict decision thresholds under duress to make sure every single shot fired can be legally justified under the totality of circumstances test that courts apply.
In a chaotic campus environment, misperception is common.
It's guaranteed. So the training must demand a legally sound pause before acting.
And then what about immediately after the event? There has to be a protocol.
Yes, mandatory post-incident conduct. The employee has to know precisely what they must and must not do in the seconds and minutes following a use of force event.
Like what?
Securing the weapon, rendering aid if it's safe to do so, and most critically, immediate communication protocols. This means notifying the institution's designated authority and contacting legal counsel immediately. Any failure here, like not securing evidence, not cooperating properly with responding officers, or making unauthorized statements to the media, can turn a legally justified shooting into a catastrophic criminal or civil liability for both the employee and the university.
So that has to be drilled repeatedly.
Over and over until it's automatic.
Okay, so pillar 2. This is where theory meets the frightening reality of stress. We've already established that shooting static targets on a quiet range is, well, it's pretty much useless for the campus reality. This pillar, judgmental training, emphasizes the absolute necessity of stress inoculation.
This training has to be highly realistic. It has to simulate the actual cognitive load of an active incident. We know that the human brain performs terribly when it's surprised, terrified, and flooded with adrenaline.
Fight or flight takes over.
It does. So judgmental training, which is often done through sophisticated simulators or live-fire force-on-force environments, helps condition the mind to function under that stress. It effectively trains the conscious mind to manage the physiological panic.
So what specific scenario environments must this training cover for it to be considered professional grade? What does that look like?
Okay, it needs to include shoot-no-shoot decision-making under simulated stress. That's foundational, but it has to be set in the right context.
I'm not a sterile range.
No. This means training in low-light environments, which are common in campus buildings during a power outage or a lockdown. It must involve navigating confined spaces, hallways, classrooms, offices, which demand specialized muzzle discipline and positional skills to avoid shooting through walls or hitting non-threats.
And the critical element that really separates civilian training from professional training. You have to incorporate innocent bystanders and multiple role players.
This is non-negotiable for liability mitigation. The scenarios can't be simple target-no-target drills. They have to involve multiple role players acting as confused students, hysterical staff, maybe even non-compliant individuals who are obstructing the line of sight.
So you're forcing the armed employee to practice dealing with that critical complexity.
Yes, incorporating innocent bystanders forces them to hold their fire, even when the actual threat is partially obscured or the angle risks collateral damage. These drills enforce that crucial judgmental pause that's necessary for safe operation on a crowded campus.
The intensity has to be there.
The intensity must mimic reality. We're talking about using marking cartridges, screaming role players, surprise attacks, anything to simulate the sensory overload of a real crisis.
The level of investment required here is significant. This demands specialized facilities and professional actors. This is way beyond basic compliance. Okay, pillar 3. Moving to the physical reality of the crisis. Even if the employee knows the law and the scenario, their body is inevitably going to work against them when it's flooded with adrenaline. This pillar focuses on maintaining control and efficacy when the body's chemistry causes those fine motor skills to just fail.
This is all about training gross motor skills to override panic and the sympathetic nervous system response. The training has to specifically address recoil management under adrenaline.
What's the difference?
On a quiet, static range, a shooter manages recoil based on conscious control and breath. Under stress, fine motor skills degrade completely. The shooter has to rely on gross motor control. The training must ensure the shooter can maintain control and accuracy even with those physiological limitations, optimizing for fast, repeatable hits, not precision bullseye shooting.
This also includes focus on foundational skills, like grip efficiency and the crucial life-saving skill of malfunction management.
Yes. If a gun malfunctions in a crisis, which is a common occurrence due to limp wristing under stress or poor magazine seating, the armed employee cannot afford to pause and think about how to fix it.
There's no time.
No time. Malfunction clearance has to be instantaneous, automatic, and smooth. It often requires training until the procedure is second nature, even under pressure, or when you can only use one hand because you're injured. This takes thousands of repetitions.
Then grip.
Grip efficiency is key because it directly counters the degradation of fine motor control. You have to train the most stable, efficient grip possible to manage the weapon when your hands are shaking and sweaty.
And speaking of limited use, the training must include one-handed and compromised shooting positions.
This acknowledges the reality that the employee might be injured. They might be multitasking, like calling 911 or escorting a student to safety. Or they might be physically constrained while taking cover. You have to train to fight effectively even when your physical platform is severely limited.
So shooting with your non-dominant hand.
Non-dominant hand only, or shooting while retreating or moving laterally. These are skills that are completely absent in minimal CCW training.
And finally, a point that, if failed, turns the armed employee into a source of weapons for the attacker. Weapon retention.
In a crowded, chaotic environment, the risk of a person trying to disarm the employee, whether they are a threat or just a panicked bystander trying to intervene, is extremely high. Continuous, physical, force-on-force training in weapon retention is absolutely necessary.
This is actual physical training.
Yes. This includes fighting for control of the weapon while standing on the ground and in close quarters grappling scenarios. The goal is to ensure the weapon remains secure in the holster or in the hands of the authorized carrier. If the employee loses their weapon, the college is now liable for a negligent entrustment that resulted in a new weapon being used against the community.
Okay, so while the previous pillars focused on the effective use of force when it's required, Pillar 4 addresses the institutional priority and that duty of care we talked about, the goal of avoiding force entirely. A firearm should be the last resort, not the first reaction, especially for an employee whose primary job is not law enforcement.
This reflects the highest ethical and legal standard. The most responsible action is always to resolve the situation without violence, if at all possible. This means the training has to emphasize advanced verbal control techniques.
Not just yelling stop.
No, these are professional communication strategies designed not just to calm, but to de-escalate tension, to gain temporary compliance, and to slow down a rapidly evolving crisis. It's about buying crucial seconds for backup to arrive or for superior decision-making.
Techniques for creating time and space are also critical here, and that can often be done without ever drawing the weapon.
Exactly. Distance management and movement. The training must focus on tactical repositioning moving to create more time and space, allows for better decision-making, and reduces the perceived immediacy of the threat. That distance gives the armed employee more opportunities to use non-lethal verbal techniques before they have to resort to force.
It's about controlling the situation.
It's about managing the OTA loop observe, orient, decide, act, using verbal control to slow down the attacker's ability to act.
The training also needs to address the moment before the crisis, right? Identifying pre-incident indicators.
This is predictive awareness. Recognizing the subtle signs that a person is about to become violent changes in their body language, specific verbal cues, target fixation, or sudden changes in breathing. These can give the employee the critical milliseconds they need to prepare, to disengage, or to call for professional help.
It's a sign of true professionalism.
It is, and it can prevent a situation from ever requiring a firearm in the first place.
So the ultimate measure of success under this pillar, then, is the avoidance of unnecessary force.
If the employee can gain control, contain the threat, or de-escalate using their training, then the firearm never needs to be drawn or used. And that is the institutional victory. The training has to instill the sense of professional restraint and reinforce the legal mandate to use force only when it is absolutely necessary and proportional to the threat. Anything less creates an unnecessary, avoidable liability.
Okay, this final pillar. This one addresses the external factor that makes the campus response so unique. The crisis isn't going to happen in a vacuum. Campus personnel will quickly be encountering official law enforcement responders who have no idea who these armed employees are.
And this isn't just a tactical vulnerability, it is a life or death operational vulnerability for the employee themselves.
Wow.
This pillar is essential for saving the lives of the authorized armed employees because they are an unrecognized, unknown element in the chaos. The specific focus here is blue-on-blue risk mitigation.
Avoiding being mistaken for a threat.
Yes, avoiding being mistaken for a threat by professional, adrenaline-fueled, responding police officers. Law enforcement is trained to move toward the sound of gunfire and neutralize the threat they see. They don't stop and conduct detailed background checks in the middle of a gunfight.
So what does that training entail practically? We must be talking about specific automatic procedures.
It involves detailed, physically rehearsed protocols. How to secure the weapon, how to drop to the ground, how to follow immediate, often loud and confusing commands from law enforcement. This requires simulation where role-playing police officers enter the scene and treat the armed employee as a potential threat until they can be identified.
So you have to train on specific identification issues.
Yes, how to identify yourself quickly and safely as friendly as an authorized carrier without making any sudden, aggressive movements that could be misinterpreted. This might involve institutionally mandated methods of visible identification, like a specific vest or ID lanyard, and the protocol for immediately disarming upon police instruction.
The response has to be instant and absolute compliance.
Yeah.
You have to overcome that natural instinct to hold on to your weapon or keep fighting.
Absolutely. The training must enforce that the moment uniformed law enforcement arrives, the employee's role shifts. They are no longer the primary interdictor, they are a witness and a supporting asset.
And the last step is the handoff.
The clear post-incident protocols for handoff and cooperation. The training has to cover the legal and tactical transition of control to the responding agencies, ensuring a smooth handoff and providing accurate, immediate information about the threat, its location, and any victims, without contaminating evidence or interfering with the official investigation.
If that's not practiced under stress.
The armed employee becomes a dangerous wild card in the official response.
So these 5 pillars, together, they define the professional standard that the source material insists upon. Anything less, as we established, just creates that paper trail of failure that is legally indefensible. So we've now completed the full arc of this analysis. The Florida Campus Carry Bill introduces extreme legal risk. The campus environment demands elite specific skills, and minimal training just accelerates institutional liability. These 5 pillars, therefore, are the non-negotiable cost of meeting that legal and operational challenge.
They define a standard of professional competence. They ensure the employee is actually prepared for the job they were authorized to do. The source material from Valortec emphasizes that they do not believe in performative safety.
Which is just checking a box.
Right. They believe in professional standards built on measurable, verifiable skills.
The source material goes a step further and highlights specific criteria for what qualifies as a legitimate, high-level training program, one that's capable of mitigating this massive liability. We should detail those necessary credentials because this is what the attorneys will be asking for after an incident.
These credentials provide the guarantee of the standard. The training must be provided by licensed professional firearms instructors. This means people who are certified, insured, and accredited by recognized bodies, not just hobbyists with personal expertise.
And crucially,
The instructors should be law enforcement credentialed trainers, people who have operational experience dealing with active threats, with high-stress scenarios, and with the complexities of use of force legal doctrine in a public setting.
and the programs themselves have to be structured and certified correctly to be defensible in court.
Yes. They must be programs built on real-world threat environments, not based on some simple target shooting fantasy. They need to rely heavily on scenario-based, judgment-driven instruction, which forces that difficult decision-making under stress.
And the methodology matters.
Deeply. The training must use biomechanics-driven shooting systems to ensure that the physical training is optimized for efficient performance under adrenaline-induced stress. This maximizes control when those fine motor skills fail.
And the entire training philosophy has to be anchored in the law.
Legally grounded use of force doctrine. This combination is what ensures a legally defensible position. So when a plaintiff attorney asks, who trained them? What were the instructor's credentials? And did the training mirror the environment where the incident occurred? The institution must be able to point to these specific high-level credentials and methodologies.
They have to be able to prove due diligence.
That's it.
So let's reiterate what this level of training is not, because that's the temptation that institutions are going to face.
Okay. It is not a weekend hobbyist class taught by an enthusiast. It is not a quick certification you get through online videos or a 2-hour refresher course. And it is certainly not watered-down security theater, designed only to give the impression of safety without delivering real competence.
This is real training.
This is real training for real consequences. And yes, it is expensive, it is time-consuming, and it is difficult. If an institution isn't willing to make that investment, the source argues they should not implement the policy.
And the source delivers a very powerful final reality check for any institution considering this policy. Allowing firearms on campus without demanding this elite training is, well, it's financially and operationally worse than doing nothing at all.
It creates a catastrophic domino effect of negative outcomes. First, it fosters false confidence among the armed personnel. It makes them more likely to intervene improperly or prematurely because they believe their minimal training actually prepared them for a complex tactical environment.
Second, it results in exponentially higher institutional liability.
Right, because the institution failed to provide training commensurate with the extreme risk they authorized, which basically confirms the negligent entrustment claim for the plaintiff.
Third, it directly leads to increased risk to students and staff.
Yes, both from the underlying threat and from the potential negligent actions of the poorly trained armed employee, especially that risk of collateral damage and friendly fire.
And finally, it creates institutional exposure that no insurance policy truly covers.
That's a huge point. Liability claims that stem from gross negligence or a demonstrative failure to train to an appropriate standard often exceeds standard policy limits. Or they fall directly into policy exclusions for professional negligence or a willful failure to mitigate risk.
So the ultimate conclusion from this structured analysis is, well, it's unavoidable.
It is. If firearms are coming to campuses via employee authorization, then high-level professional specialized training must come with them. Or the law, specifically the civil judicial system, will eventually enforce the lesson the hard way.
Through devastating, multi-million-dollar judgments.
The high cost of professional training is merely a fraction of the eventual cost of a catastrophic institutional failure. #tag outro.
This has been an incredibly structured and I think a crucial deep dive. It's taken us from a highly political headline to a clear, actionable, legal, and risk management imperative. The insight here is really clear. Permissions are easy to grant, but professional standards are what truly matter.
And they're what courts demand when they're mitigating high-stakes risk.
Right.
It's the difference between being merely compliant with a state law and being operationally competent in a crisis. Thank you for bringing this high-quality source material to our attention. It forces a volatile issue to be framed in terms of tangible risk reduction, which is exactly the level of detail our listeners need.
Before we sign off, let's leave the listener with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something that extends this concept of professional standards beyond just this specific context of firearms.
Absolutely. The concept of failure to train to an appropriate standard is applicable far beyond carrying a weapon. If inadequate training exposes an institution to legal risk in this highest stakes scenario, consider where else in your daily professional or personal life minimal training might constitute a dangerous negligence.
Good point.
Think about the emergency first responder training protocols in your workplace, or crisis communication strategies for a major organizational failure, or even the training provided to staff who manage highly sensitive financial or medical data. What is the appropriate standard, not the minimal standard, for the most critical risks you face? And is your current preparation meeting that benchmark?
It's a powerful framework for assessing true preparation versus simple regulatory compliance. If you authorize the risk, you must authorize the required training.
Indeed. We'd encourage you to explore the concept of duty of care and negligent entrustment in various professional contexts, applying the same critical lens we use today.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.